Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the February 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Critical Remarks on the National Question by Lenin from 1913. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this text was written in October to December 1913. It was published in 1913 in the journal Prozveshchenia, numbers 10, 11, and 12. It was signed V. Ilyin and published according to the journal text. The source is Lenin, Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972, Moscow, Volume 20. It was translated by Bernard Isaacs and the late Joe Feinberg. HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain at the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to the Marxists Internet Archive for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out and support them and or volunteer for them if you can. So this text has 6 chapters. The first chapter is Liberals and Democrats on the Language Question. 2 is National Culture. 3 is Nationalist Bogey of Assimilation. 4 is Cultural National Autonomy. 5 is The Equality of Nations and the Rights of National Minorities. And 6 is Centralization and Autonomy. As usual with any of the longer texts, if anyone out there listening would like to make note of the timestamps of each section and then put them in a comment, I will put them into the video description, which then breaks the video up on YouTube. So thanks in advance for anyone contributing to that. This text, before we get into Chapter 1, begins with a publisher's note. It says, the article, Critical Remarks on the National Question, was written by Lenin in October to December 1913 and published the same year in the Bolshevik legal journal, Prozveshchenia, numbers 10, 11, and 12. The article was preceded by lectures on the national question, which Lenin delivered in a number of Swiss cities, Zurich, Geneva, Lausanne, and Bern, in the summer of 1913. In the autumn of 1913, Lenin made a report on the national question at the summer conference of the Central Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party with party workers. A resolution on the report drafted by Lenin was adopted. After the conference, Lenin started work on his article, Critical Remarks on the National Question. So we're going to start that work now. Let's get into the text. It is obvious that the national question has now become prominent among the problems of Russian public life. The aggressive nationalism of the reactionaries, the transition of counter-revolutionary bourgeois liberalism to nationalism, particularly Great Russian, but also Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian, etc. And lastly, the increase of nationalist vacillations among the different, quote, national, i.e., non-Great Russian, Social Democrats, who have gone to the length of violating the party program. All these make it incumbent on us to give more attention to the national question than we have done so far. This article pursues a special object, namely, to examine in their general bearing precisely these program vacillations of Marxists and would-be Marxists on the national question. In Severnaya Pravda number 29, for September 5, 1913, Liberals and Democrats on the Language Question, I had occasion to speak of the opportunism of the liberals on the national question. This article of mine was attacked by the opportunist Jewish newspaper Zeit, Time, in an article by Mr. F. Liebman. From the other side, the program of the Russian Marxists on the national question has been criticized by the Ukrainian opportunist Mr. Lev Yurkevich in Jvin, 1913, numbers 7 through 8. Both these writers touched on so many questions that to reply to them, we are obliged to deal with the most diverse aspects of the subject. I think that the most convenient thing would be to start with a reprint of the article from Severnaya Pravda. So commenting, we're about to read that article which Lenin had published, just so that everybody can understand what they were talking about. However, first there are 3 footnotes. So the first is Severnaya Pravda, or Northern Truth, was one of the names of the newspaper Pravda. Pravda, a legal Bolshevik daily, published in St. Petersburg. It was founded on the initiative of the St. Petersburg workers in April 1912. Pravda was a popular working-class newspaper, published with money collected by the workers themselves. A wide circle of worker correspondents and worker publicists formed around the newspaper. Over 11,000 correspondence items from workers were published in a single year. Pravda had an average circulation of 40,000, with some issues running into 60,000 copies. Lenin directed Pravda from abroad where he was living. He wrote for the paper almost daily, gave instructions to the editorial board, and rallied the party's best literary forces around the newspaper. Pravda was subjected to constant police persecution. During the first year of its existence, it was confiscated 41 times, and 36 legal actions were brought against its editors, who served prison sentences totaling 47.5 months. In the course of 2 years and 3 months, Pravda was closed down 8 times by the Tsarist government, but reissued under new names: Rabochaya Pravda, Severnaya Pravda, Pravda Truda, Za Pravdu, Proletarskaya Pravda, Put Pravdi, Rabochi, and Trudovaya Pravda. On July 8, 1914, on the eve of the First World War, the paper was closed down. Publication was not resumed until after the February Revolution. Beginning from March 5, 1917, Pravda appeared as the central organ of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Lenin joined the editorial board on April 5 on his return from abroad, and he took over the paper's management. In July to October 1917, Pravda changed its name frequently, owing to persecution by the provisional government, appearing successively as Listok Pravdi, Proletari, Rabochi, and Rabochi Put. On October 27, the newspaper began to appear under its old name, Pravda. So the next note is on Zeit, or Time, a weekly organ of the Bund, published in Yiddish in St. Petersburg from December 20, 1912, to May 5, 1914. Dvin, or the Bell, was a monthly legal nationalist journal of Menshevik trend, published in the Ukrainian language in Kiev from January 1913 to the middle of 1914. And Mensheviks, as opposed to the Bolsheviks became what we would think of as communists today. The Mensheviks became what we would think of as social democrats today, sort of more reformist, more of a reformed welfare capitalist type of approach. So now we're going to go back to the main text, and this is the section where Lenin reprints his article, Liberals and Democrats on the Language Question. Here we go. On several occasions, the newspapers have mentioned the report of the governor of the Caucasus, a report that is noteworthy, not for its Black Hundred spirit, but for its timid, quote, liberalism. So, another footnote here, the Black Hundreds were monarchist gangs formed by the Tsarist police to fight the revolutionary movement. They murdered revolutionaries, assaulted progressive intellectuals, and organized pogroms. So, who can we draw some parallel to today? Well, these are reactionary gangs, like the most, at that time, monarchist, reactionary gangs formed by the police to fight the revolutionary movement. We could say things like the Proud Boys or other reactionary right-wing vigilante gangs. You know, ask yourself, who today would be interested in murdering revolutionaries, assaulting progressive intellectuals, and organizing pogroms? Well, look at your alt-right various, street fighting groups, and there you go. Anyway, picking up with Lenin, so this report is noteworthy not for its Black Hundred spirit, but for its timid, quote, liberalism. Among other things, the governor of the Caucasus objects to artificial Russification of non-Russian nationalities. Representatives of non-Russian nationalities in the Caucasus are themselves striving to teach their children Russian. An example of this is the Armenian church schools, in which the teaching of Russian is not obligatory. Russkoye Slovo, number 198, one of the most widely circulating liberal newspapers in Russia, points to this fact and draws the correct conclusion that the hostility towards the Russian language in Russia, quote, stems exclusively from the artificial, Lenin adds it should have said forced, implanting of that language, of the Russian language. There's a footnote there. Russkoye Slovo, or the Russian Word, was a daily published in Moscow from 1895, the first trial issue appeared in 1894, to July 1918. Formally non-party, the paper defended the interests of the Russian bourgeoisie from a moderate liberal platform. News was given a wide coverage in the paper, which was the first in Russia to send special correspondence to all the large cities at home and to many foreign capitals. Okay, I think we have a little break from footnotes for a minute, so back to the main text. Quote, There is no reason to worry about the fate of the Russian language. It will itself win recognition throughout Russia, says the newspaper. End of quote. This is perfectly true because the requirements of economic exchange will always compel the nationalities living in one state, as long as they wish to live together, to study the language of the majority. The more democratic the political system in Russia becomes, the more powerfully, rapidly, and extensively capitalism will develop. The more urgently will the requirements of economic exchange impel various nationalities to study the language most convenient for general commercial relations. The liberal newspaper, however, hastens to slap itself in the face and demonstrate its liberal inconsistency. Quote, even those who oppose Russification, it says, would hardly be likely to deny that in a country as huge as Russia, there must be one single official language, and that this language can be only Russian. Unquote. Logic turned inside out. Tiny Switzerland has not lost anything, but has gained from having not one single official language, but three: German, French, and Italian. In Switzerland, 70% of the population are Germans. In Russia, 43% are Great Russians. 22% French. In Russia, 17% are Ukrainians. And 7% Italians. In Russia, 6% are Poles and 4.5% Belarusians. If Italians in Switzerland often speak French in their common parliament, they do not do so because they are menaced by some savage police law. There are none such in Switzerland, but because the civilized citizens of a democratic state themselves prefer a language that is understood by a majority. The French language does not instill hatred in Italians because it is the language of a free civilized nation, a language that is not imposed by disgusting police measures. Why should, quote, huge Russia, a much more varied and terribly backward country, inhibit her development by the retention of any kind of privilege for any one language? Should not the contrary be true, liberal gentlemen? Should not Russia, if she wants to overtake Europe, put an end to every kind of privilege as quickly as possible, as completely as possible, and as vigorously as possible? If all privileges disappear, if the imposition of any one language ceases, all Slavs will easily and rapidly learn to understand each other and will not be frightened by the, quote, horrible thought that speeches in different languages will be heard in the common parliament. The requirements of economic exchange will themselves decide which language of the given country it is to the advantage of the majority to know in the interests of commercial relations. This decision will be all the firmer because it is adopted voluntarily by a population of various nationalities, and its adoption will be the more rapid and extensive, the more consistent the democracy, and, as a consequence of it, the more rapid the development of capitalism. The liberals approach the language question in the same way as they approach all political questions, like hypocritical hucksters, holding out one hand openly to democracy, and the other behind their backs to the feudalists and police. Well put. We are against privileges, shout the liberals, and under cover they haggle with the feudalists for first one and then another privilege. Such is the nature of all liberal bourgeois nationalism, not only Great Russian. It is the worst of them all because of its violent character and its kinship with the Purishkeviches. Footnote there, V.M. Purishkevich lived from 1870 to 1920, was a big landlord and rabid reactionary, a Black Hundred monarchist. Continuing, but Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian, Georgian, and every other nationalism. Under the slogan of, quote, national culture, the bourgeoisie of all nations, both in Austria and in Russia, are in fact pursuing the policy of splitting the workers, emasculating democracy, and haggling with the feudalists over the sale of the people's rights and the people's liberty. The slogan of working-class democracy is not national culture, but the international culture of democracy and the worldwide working-class movement. Let the bourgeoisie deceive the people with various positive national programs. The class-conscious worker will answer the bourgeoisie. There is only one solution to the national problem, insofar as it can, in general, be solved in the capitalist world, that is the world of profit, squabbling, and exploitation. And that solution is consistent democracy. The proof, Switzerland in Western Europe, a country with an old culture, and Finland in Eastern Europe, a country with a young culture. The national program of working-class democracy is absolutely no privileges for any one nation or any one language. the solution of the problem of the political self-determination of nations, that is, their separation as states by completely free, democratic methods, the promulgation of a law for the whole state by virtue of which any measure, rural, urban, or communal, etc., introducing any privilege of any kind for one of the nations, and militating against the equality of nations, or the rights of a national minority, shall be declared illegal and ineffective, and any citizen of the state shall have the right to demand that such a measure be annulled as unconstitutional, and that those who attempt to put it into effect be punished. Working-class democracy contraposes to the nationalist wrangling of the various bourgeois parties over questions of language, etc., the demand for the unconditional unity and complete amalgamation of workers of all nationalities in all working-class organizations, trade union, cooperative, consumers, educational, and all others, in contradistinction to any kind of bourgeois nationalism. Only this type of unity and amalgamation can uphold democracy and defend the interests of the workers against capital, which is already international and is becoming more so, and promote the development of mankind towards a new way of life that is alien to all privileges and all exploitation. And that's the end of Chapter 1. Now moving on to Chapter 2, National Culture. As the reader will see, the article in Severnaya Pravda made use of a particular example, i.e. the problem of the official language, to illustrate the inconsistency and opportunism of the liberal bourgeoisie, which, in the national question, extends a hand to the feudalists and the police. Everybody will understand that, apart from the problem of an official language, the liberal bourgeoisie behaves just as treacherously, hypocritically, and stupidly, even from the standpoint of the interests of liberalism, in a number of other related issues. The conclusion to be drawn from this, it is that all liberal bourgeois nationalism sows the greatest corruption among the workers and does immense harm to the cause of freedom and the proletarian class struggle. This bourgeois and bourgeois feudalist tendency is all the more dangerous for its being concealed behind the slogan of national culture. It is under the guise of national culture, Great Russian, Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian, and so forth, that the Black Hundreds and the clericals, and also the bourgeoisie of all nations, are doing their dirty and reactionary work. So just a quick comment here. The situation that Lenin was writing about in Russia at this time, 1913, is there was a growing movement against Tsarism. There had been the revolution of 1905, which forced some reforms to the Tsarist system, and you had a bourgeoisie, a capitalist class that was emerging, but there still had not been a formal overthrow of the feudal Tsarist system at this point. So although the bourgeoisie was wealthy, propertied, and controlled the capitalism that existed at that time, they were, relative to the prevailing feudal Tsarism, a progressive force. They were sort of resistance fighters, if you will, against Tsarism. However, not nearly to the extent that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was, and particularly the Bolsheviks. So, in other words, at this point in 1913, we're still several years out from the overthrow of the Tsar, and the bourgeoisie, after the overthrow of the Tsar, was planning, along with their Menshevik and social revolutionary henchmen, basically, who sided with the bourgeoisie in that situation, against the Bolsheviks. They were planning on just setting up a bourgeois capitalist republic in Russia. Of course, the Bolsheviks outmaneuvered them in 1917, and they quickly had a socialist revolution right after the bourgeois one. So when Lenin calls the bourgeoisie opportunist, normally we're talking about opportunism from the point of view of socialists working with people with a diametrically opposed, fundamentally different class interest. That would be proletarians working with the bourgeoisie. That's a right-wing error. You don't want to make that. But for the bourgeoisie, their opportunism is working with the feudalists. That is their right-wing error, if you will. Just remember that all these things are relative to the state of historical development and so forth. So anyway, continuing with the text. Such are the facts of the national life of today, if viewed from the Marxist angle, i.e. from the standpoint of the class struggle, and if the slogans are compared with the interests and policies of classes, and not with meaningless general principles, declamations, and phrases. The slogan of national culture is a bourgeois and often also a black hundred and clerical, i.e. monarchist and deeply reactionary, fraud. Our slogan is the international culture of democracy and of the world working class movement. Here the Bundist, Mr. Liebman, rushes into the fray and annihilates me with the following deadly tirade. And before we get to that quote, there's a footnote here on the Bund. The Bund, or the General Jewish Workers' Union of Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, came into being in 1897 at the inaugural Congress of Jewish Social Democratic Groups in Vilna. And again, another footnote, when they say social democratic prior to 1917, this was the general term for Marxism. It consisted mainly of semi-proletarian Jewish artisans of Western Russia. At the first Congress of the RSDLP, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, in 1898, the Bund joined the latter, quote, as an autonomous organization, independent only in respect of questions affecting the Jewish proletariat specifically, unquote. The Bund was a vehicle of nationalist and separatist ideas in Russia's working class movement. In April 1901, the Bund's Fourth Congress resolved to alter the organizational ties with the RSDLP as established by the latter's First Congress. In its resolution, the Bund Congress declared that it regarded the RSDLP as a federation of national organizations, of which the Bund was a federal member. Following the rejection by the Second Congress of the RSDLP of the Bund's demand for recognition as the sole representative of the Jewish proletariat, the Bund left the party, but rejoined it in 1906 on the basis of a decision of the Fourth Unity Congress. Within the RSDLP, the Bund constantly supported the party's opportunist wing, the economists, Mensheviks, and liquidators, and waged a struggle against the Bolsheviks and Bolshevism. To the Bolsheviks' programmatic demand for the right of nations to self-determination, the Bund contraposed the demand for autonomy of the national culture. During the years of the Stolypin reaction and the new revolutionary upsurge, the Bund adopted a liquidationist stand and played an active part in the formation of the August anti-party bloc. During the First World War, 1914-18, the Bundists took a social chauvinist stand. In 1917, the Bund supported the bourgeois provisional government, and that was what I was saying before. After the overthrow of the Tsar in February 1917, the bourgeoisie started setting up this provisional government, and the Mensheviks and others, not the Bolsheviks, sided with the enemies of the Great October Socialist Revolution. During the foreign military intervention and the Civil War which followed, the Bundist leaders made common cause with the forces of counter-revolution. At the same time, a tendency toward cooperation with the Soviets became apparent among the Bund rank-and-file members. In March 1921, the Bund dissolved itself, part of the membership joining the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, in accordance with the general rules of admission. So now on to Mr. Liebman's quote. Quote, anyone in the least familiar with the national question knows that international culture is not non-national culture, culture without a national form. Non-national culture, which must not be Russian, Jewish, or Polish, but only pure culture, is nonsense. International ideas can appeal to the working class only when they are adapted to the language spoken by the worker, and to the concrete national conditions under which they live. The workers should not be indifferent to the condition and development of their national culture, because it is through it, and only through it, that they are able to participate in the, quote, international culture of democracy and of the world working class movement. This is well known, but V.I. Lenin turns a deaf ear to it all, unquote. Ponder over this typically Bundist argument, designed, if you please, to demolish the Marxist thesis that I have advanced. With the air of supreme self-confidence of one who is, quote, familiar with the national question, this Bundist passes off ordinary bourgeois views as, quote, well-known axioms. It is true, my dear Bundist, that international culture is not non-national. Nobody said that it was. Nobody has proclaimed a pure culture, either Polish, Jewish, or Russian, etc., and your jumble of empty words is simply an attempt to distract the reader's attention and to obscure the issue with tinkling words. The elements of democratic and socialist culture are present, if only in rudimentary form, in every national culture, since in every nation There are toiling and exploited masses, whose conditions of life inevitably give rise to the ideology of democracy and socialism. But every nation also possesses a bourgeois culture, and most nations a reactionary and clerical culture as well, in the form not merely of elements, but of the dominant culture. Therefore, the general national culture is the culture of the landlords, the clergy, and the bourgeoisie. This fundamental and, for a Marxist, elementary truth was kept in the background by the Bundist, who drowned it in his jumble of words, i.e., instead of revealing and clarifying the class gulf to the reader, he in fact obscured it. In fact, the Bundist acted like a bourgeois, whose every interest requires the spreading of a belief in a non-class national culture. In advancing the slogan of the international culture of democracy and of the world working class movement, we take from each national culture only its democratic and socialist elements. We take them only and absolutely in opposition to the bourgeois culture and the bourgeois nationalism of each nation. No Democrat, and certainly no Marxist, denies that all languages should have equal status, or that it is necessary to engage in polemics with one's native bourgeoisie in one's native language, and to advocate anti-clerical or anti-bourgeois ideas among one's, quote, native peasantry and petty bourgeoisie. That goes without saying, but the Bundist uses these indisputable truths to obscure the point in dispute, i.e. the real issue. The question is whether it is permissible for a Marxist, directly or indirectly, to advance the slogan of national culture, or whether he should oppose it by advocating, in all languages, the slogan of workers' internationalism while, quote, adapting himself to all local and national features. The significance of the national culture slogan is not determined by some petty intellectual's promise or good intention to, quote, interpret it as, quote, meaning the development through it of an international culture. It would be puerile subjectivism to look at it in that way. The significance of the slogan of national culture is determined by the objective alignment of all classes in a given country and in all countries of the world. The national culture of the bourgeoisie is a fact, and I repeat, the bourgeoisie everywhere enters into deals with the landed proprietors and the clergy. Aggressive bourgeois nationalism, which drugs the mind of the workers, stultifies and disunites them in order that the bourgeoisie may lead them by the halter. Such is the fundamental fact of the times. Those who seek to serve the proletariat must unite the workers of all nations and unswervingly fight bourgeois nationalism, domestic and foreign. The place of those who advocate the slogan of national culture is among the nationalist petty bourgeois, not among the Marxists. Take a concrete example. Can a great Russian Marxist accept the slogan of national Great Russian culture? No, he cannot. Anyone who does that should stand in the ranks of the nationalists, not of the Marxists. Our task is to fight the dominant Black Hundred and bourgeois national culture of the Great Russians, and to develop, exclusively in the internationalist spirit and in the closest alliance with the workers of other countries, the rudiments also existing in the history of our democratic and working class movement. Fight your own Great Russian landlords and bourgeoisie. Fight their culture in the name of internationalism, and in so fighting, adapt yourself to the special features of the Purishkeviches and Struves. That is your task, not preaching or tolerating the slogan of national culture. So I just want to comment here because I think that these two paragraphs are really important and contain some key ideas, so I'm just going to walk through them again. So Lenin says, those who seek to serve the proletariat must unite the workers of all nations. Okay, that's pretty clear. And unswervingly fight bourgeois nationalism, both domestic and foreign. The place of those who advocate the slogan of national culture is among the nationalist petty bourgeois, people who, I would say, tend towards fascism, not among the Marxists. Take a concrete example, Lenin continues. Can a Great Russian Marxist accept the slogan of national Great Russian culture? No, he cannot. Anyone who does that should stand in the ranks of the nationalists, not of the Marxists. So, okay, first of all, what is a Great Russian? Remember that Russia was an empire, so Great Russian is a term that pertains to Russia proper rather than some of the outlying territories. Okay, so Lenin is basically saying, can a Russian Marxist accept the slogan of national Russian culture? No. The answer is very clear. No. Anyone who does that, Lenin says, is a nationalist and not a Marxist. So Lenin continues, our task is to fight the dominant Black Hundred and bourgeois national culture of the great Russians. Okay, that's also pretty clear. So Lenin says that take that existing conservative, reactionary Black Hundred culture and the bourgeois national culture of Russia, Great Russia here, quote, and to develop exclusively in the internationalist spirit and in the closest alliance with the workers of other countries, the rudiments also existing in the history of our democratic and working class movement. Fight your own great Russian landlords and bourgeoisie. Fight their culture. That's very clear. Fight their culture in the name of internationalism. And in so fighting, adapt yourself to the special features of the Purishkeviches and Struves. That is your task, not preaching or tolerating the slogan of national culture. So let's break that down. Lenin says here, should Marxists accept the slogan of national culture of whatever country they're in this case, Russia? He says no. Anyone who does that stands in the ranks of reactionaries and the bourgeoisie. In fact, the task is to fight that culture and to develop instead, and quote, exclusively in the internationalist spirit and in alliance with the workers of other countries, a working class culture which is adapted to local conditions, in other words, that talks about the specific conditions that workers face in a particular area, but which is internationalist in its principles. In other words, the principles are going to be the same in every nation, just only the specifics will be different because the particular landlords will be different from country to country. The particular reactionaries will be different from country to country. The particular bourgeoisie will be different. The particular struggles will vary from place to place, but the same basic struggle is being waged everywhere. That's the idea of the internationalist spirit. So you get a working class culture about that, but specifically, quote, not preaching or tolerating the slogan of national culture. Why? Because in a feudal or capitalist country, that national culture belongs to the bourgeoisie and other reactionary, maybe feudal elements if the country still has elements of feudalism. And so basically, if you're going to preach or tolerate the slogan of national culture, Lenin says, go stand in the ranks of the nationalists, not the Marxists, because that's where you belong. You're defending basically the property of the bourgeois nationalists. So that's where you belong in that case. Instead, fight that culture as you fight its owners, the bourgeoisie and their allies. All right, continuing. The same applies to the most oppressed and persecuted nation, the Jews. Jewish national culture is the slogan of the rabbis and the bourgeoisie, the slogan of our enemies. But there are other elements in Jewish culture and in Jewish history as a whole. Of the 10.5 million Jews in the world, somewhat over a half live in Galicia and Russia, backward and semi-barbarous countries, where the Jews are forcibly kept in the status of a caste. The other half lives in the civilized world, and there the Jews do not live as a segregated caste. There, the great world progressive features of Jewish culture stand clearly revealed. Its internationalism, its identification with the advanced movements of the epoch, the percentage of Jews in the democratic and proletarian movements is everywhere higher than the percentage of Jews among the population. Whoever, directly or indirectly, puts forward the slogan of Jewish national culture is, whatever his good intentions may be, an enemy of the proletariat, a supporter of all that is outmoded and connected with caste among the Jewish people. They're an accomplice of the rabbis and the bourgeoisie. On the other hand, those Jewish Marxists who mingle with the Russian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and other workers in international Marxist organizations and make their contribution, both in Russian and in Yiddish, towards creating the international culture of the working class movement. Those Jews, despite the separatism of the Bund, uphold the best traditions of Jewry, by fighting the slogan of national culture. Bourgeois nationalism and proletarian internationalism. These are the two irreconcilably hostile slogans that correspond to the two great class camps throughout the capitalist world, and express the two policies, nay, the two world outlooks, in the national question. In advocating the slogan of national culture and building up on it an entire plan and practical program of what they call cultural national autonomy, the Bundists are, in effect, instruments of bourgeois nationalism among the workers. So that's the end of Chapter 2. Now moving on to Chapter 3, the nationalist bogey of assimilation. The question of assimilation, i.e. of the shedding of national features and absorption by another nation, strikingly illustrates the consequences of the nationalist vacillations of the Bundists and their fellow thinkers. Mr. Liebman, who faithfully conveys and repeats the stock arguments, or rather tricks, of the Bundists, has qualified as the old assimilation story, the demand for the unity and amalgamation of the workers of all nationalities in a given country in united workers' organizations. Quote, consequently, says Mr. F. Liebman, commenting on the concluding part of the article in Severnaya Pravda, see the first section of this file, quote, if asked what nationality he belongs to, the worker must answer, I am a social democrat, unquote. Our Bundist considers this the acme of wit. As a matter of fact, he gives himself away completely by such witticisms and outcries about assimilation, leveled against a consistently democratic and Marxist slogan. Developing capitalism knows two historical tendencies in the national question. The first is the awakening of national life and national movements, the struggle against all national oppression, and the creation of national states. The second is the development and growing frequency of international intercourse in every form, the breakdown of national barriers, the creation of the international unity of capital, of economic life in general, of politics, science, etc. Both tendencies are a universal law of capitalism. The former predominates in the beginning of its development. The latter characterizes a more mature capitalism that's moving towards its transformation into socialist society. The Marxists' national program takes both tendencies into account and advocates, firstly, the equality of nations and languages and the impermissibility of all privileges in this respect, and also the right of nations to self-determination, with which we shall deal separately later. Secondly, the principle of internationalism and uncompromising struggle against contamination of the proletariat with bourgeois nationalism, even of the most refined kind. So let's just pause here for a second. So Lenin says that there are two major historical tendencies with regard to the national question in capitalism. The first is the awakening of national life and national movements, so basically the formation of national movements, the struggle of those movements against oppression of them by nationality, and eventually the creation of national states. This is the bourgeois democratic revolution against feudalism, the creation of the bourgeois nation state. So that's the first tendency, more in early capitalism. The second tendency is, quote, the development and growing frequency of international intercourse in every form. So basically, once you have a bunch of bourgeois nation states, they trade with each other. So you get international intercourse. This then results in the breakdown of national barriers, the creation of the international unity of capital, of economic life in general, politics, science, etc. Lenin says that the former is an earlier trend, and the latter characterizes mature capitalism edging into socialism because it has created these nation states as kind of a platform for developing capitalism and commerce, creating a world market. And then once that world market is created, that world market becomes something bigger than the nation states and kind of starts to crush the boundaries that the nation state has formed. Various reactionaries are certainly inclined to try to take up nationalism to protect those borders against, what they call communism, which is really just advanced capitalism. But they think it's communism because they don't really understand anything. You don't actually get socialism, communism until there is a working class revolution against the bourgeoisie, but that goes way over their heads. Also that functionally there is no turning back from advanced capitalism towards, just the strong individual nation state. They don't get that either. Though, of course, they can make a huge mess in their quest for power and trying to turn back the wheel of history in that particular way, but anyway, it's not possible. Continuing, the question arises, what does our Bundist mean when he cries out to heaven against assimilation? He could not have meant the oppression of nations, or the privileges enjoyed by a particular nation, because the word assimilation here does not fit at all, because all Marxists, individually and as an official, united whole, have quite definitely and unambiguously condemned the slightest violence against and oppression and inequality of nations, and finally because this general Marxist idea, which the Bundist has attacked, is expressed in the Severnaya Pravda article in the most emphatic manner. No, evasion is impossible here. In condemning assimilation, Mr. Liebman had in mind not violence, not inequality, and not privileges. Is there anything real left in the concept of assimilation after all violence and all inequality have been eliminated? Yes, there undoubtedly is. What is left is capitalism's world historical tendency to break down national barriers, obliterate national distinctions, and to assimilate nations, a tendency which manifests itself more and more powerfully with every passing decade, and is one of the greatest driving forces transforming capitalism into socialism. Whoever does not recognize and champion the equality of nations and languages, and does not fight against all national oppression or inequality, is not a Marxist, he is not even a Democrat. That is beyond doubt. But it is also beyond doubt that the pseudo-Marxist, who heaps abuse upon a Marxist of another nation for being an assimilator, is simply a nationalist Philistine. In this unhandsome category of people are all the Bundists, and, as we shall shortly see, Ukrainian nationalist socialists such as L. Yurkovich, Dontsov, and company. To show concretely how reactionary the views held by these nationalist Philistines are, we shall cite facts of three kinds. It is the Jewish nationalists in Russia in general, and the Bundists in particular, who vociferate most about Russian Orthodox Marxists being assimilators. Yet, as the aforementioned figures show, out of the 10.5 million Jews all over the world, about half that number live in the civilized world, where conditions favoring assimilation are strongest, whereas the unhappy, downtrodden, disenfranchised Jews in Russia and Galicia, who are crushed under the heel of the Purishkeviches, Russian and Polish, live where conditions for assimilation least prevail, where there's most segregation, and even a Pale of Settlement, a numerus clausus, and other charming features of the Purishkevich regime. There are a couple of footnotes there. The Pale of Settlement, these were districts in Tsarist Russia where Jews were permitted permanent residence, and the numerus clausus, this was the numerical restriction imposed in Tsarist Russia on admissions of Jews to the state secondary and higher educational establishments, to employment at factories and offices, and the professions. Remember, anti-Jewish discrimination was extremely high in Tsarist Russia. In addition to what Lenin has described here, there were also pogroms, or fatal public attacks on Jewish communities. This was also probably the country where the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion originated. This is a fabricated document describing a world Jewish conspiracy for global domination. It is still to this day influential on fascists. You can find them in various pockets of the internet, still discussing its authenticity and whatnot. It's also not uncommonly cited in connection with anti-communist propaganda. Of course, anti-communism and fascism having huge overlap. Back to the text. The Jews in the civilized world are not a nation. They have in the main become assimilated, say Karl Kautsky and Otto Bauer. The Jews in Galicia and in Russia are not a nation, unfortunately, through no fault of their own, but through that of the Purishkeviches. They are still a caste here. Such is the incontrovertible judgment who are undoubtedly familiar with the history of Jewry and take the above cited facts into consideration. What do these facts prove? It is that only Jewish reactionary Philistines, who want to turn back the wheel of history and make it proceed not from the conditions prevailing in Russia and Galicia to those prevailing in Paris and New York, but in the reverse direction. Only they can clamor against assimilation. The best Jews, those who are celebrated in world history and have given the world foremost leaders of democracy and socialism, have never clamored against assimilation. It is only those who contemplate the rear aspect of Jewry with reverential awe that clamor against assimilation. A rough idea of the scale which the general process of assimilation of nations is assuming under the present conditions of advanced capitalism may be obtained, for example, from the immigration statistics of the United States of America. During the decade between 1891 and 1900, Europe sent 3,700,000 people there, and during the 9 years between 1901 and 1909, 7,200,000. The 1900 census in the United States recorded over 10 million foreigners. New York State, in which, according to the same census, there were over 78,000 Austrians, 136,000 Englishmen, 20,000 Frenchmen, 480,000 Germans, 37,000 Hungarians, 425,000 Irish, 182,000 Italians, 70,000 Poles, 166,000 people from Russia, mostly Jews, 43,000 Swedes, etc., grinds down national distinctions. And what is taking place on a grand international scale in New York is also to be seen in every big city and industrial township. No one unobsessed by nationalist prejudices can fail to perceive that this process of assimilation of nations by capitalism means the greatest historical progress, the breakdown of hidebound national conservatism in the various backwoods, especially in backward countries like Russia. Take Russia and the attitude of great Russians toward the Ukrainians. Naturally, every Democrat, not to mention Marxists, will strongly oppose the incredible humiliation of Ukrainians and demand complete equality for them. But it would be a downright betrayal of socialism and a silly policy even from the standpoint of the bourgeois, quote, national aims of the Ukrainians to weaken the ties and the alliance between the Ukrainian and Great Russian proletariat that now exist within the confines of a single state. Mr. Lev Yurkovich, who calls himself a Marxist, poor Marx, is an example of that silly policy. In 1906, Sokolovsky, Basok, and Lukashevich, Chuchovsky, asserted, Mr. Yurkovich writes that the Ukrainian proletariat had become completely Russified and needed no separate organization. Without quoting a single fact bearing on the direct issue, Mr. Yurkovich falls upon both for saying this and cries out hysterically, quite in the spirit of the basest, most stupid, and most reactionary nationalism, that this is national passivity, national renunciation, that these men have, quote, split the Ukrainian Marxists, and so forth. Today, despite the, quote, growth of Ukrainian national consciousness among the workers, unquote, the minority of the workers are, quote, nationally conscious, while the majority, Mr. Yurkovich assures us, quote, are still under the influence of Russian culture, unquote. And it is our duty, this nationalist Philistine exclaims, quote, not to follow the masses, but to lead them, to explain to them their national aims, unquote. This argument of Mr. Yurkovich's is wholly bourgeois nationalistic. But even from the point of view of the bourgeois nationalists, some of whom stand for complete equality and autonomy for the Ukraine, while others stand for an independent Ukrainian state, this argument will not wash. The Ukrainians striving for liberation is opposed by the Great Russian and Polish landlord class, and by the bourgeoisie of these two nations. What social force is capable of standing up to these classes? The first decade of the 20th century provided an actual reply to this question. That force is none other than the working class, which rallies the democratic peasantry behind it. By striving to divide and thereby weaken the genuinely democratic force, whose victory would make national oppression impossible, Mr. Yurkovich is betraying not only the interests of democracy in general, but also the interests of his own country, the Ukraine. Given united action by the Great Russian and Ukrainian proletarians, a free Ukraine is possible. Without such unity, it's out of the question. But Marxists do not confine themselves to the bourgeois national standpoint. For several decades, a well-defined process of accelerated economic development has been going on in the South, i.e. the Ukraine, attracting hundreds of thousands of peasants and workers from Great Russia to the capitalist farms, mines, and cities. The assimilation, within these limits, of the Great Russian and Ukrainian proletariat is an indisputable fact, and this fact is undoubtedly progressive. Capitalism is replacing the ignorant, conservative, settled mujik of the Great Russian or Ukrainian backwoods with a mobile proletarian whose conditions of life break down specifically national narrow-mindedness, both Great Russian and Ukrainian. Even if we assume that in time there will be a state frontier between Great Russia and the Ukraine, the historically progressive nature of the assimilation of the Great Russian and Ukrainian workers will be as undoubted as the progressive nature of the grinding down of nations in America. The freer the Ukraine and Great Russia become, the more extensive and more rapid will be the development of capitalism, which will still more powerfully attract the workers, the working masses of all nations, from all regions of the state and from all the neighboring states, should Russia become a neighboring state in relation to the Ukraine, to the cities, the mines, and the factories. Mr. Lev Yurkovich acts like a real bourgeois, and a short-sighted, narrow-minded, obtuse bourgeois at that, i.e., like a Philistine, when he dismisses the benefits to be gained from the intercourse, amalgamation, and assimilation of the proletariat of the two nations, for the sake of the momentary success of the Ukrainian national cause. The national cause comes first, and the proletarian cause second, the bourgeois nationalists say, with the Yurkoviches, Dontsovs, and similar would-be Marxists repeating it after them. The proletarian cause must come first, we say, because it not only protects the lasting and fundamental interests of labor and of humanity, but also those of democracy. And without democracy, neither an autonomous nor an independent Ukraine is conceivable. Another point to be noted in Mr. Yurkovich's argument, which is so extraordinarily rich in nationalist gems, is this. The minority of Ukrainian workers are nationally conscious. He says, quote, "The majority are still under the influence of Russian culture," unquote. Contraposing Ukrainian culture as a whole to Great Russian culture as a whole, when speaking of the proletariat, is a gross betrayal of the proletariat's interests for the benefit of bourgeois nationalism. There are two nations in every modern nation, we say to all nationalist socialists. There are two national cultures in every national culture. There is the Great Russian culture of the Purishkeviches, Guchkovs, and Struvs, but there is also the Great Russian culture typified in the names of Chernyshevsky and Plekhanov. There are the same two cultures in the Ukraine as there are in Germany, in France, in England, among the Jews, and so forth. If the majority of the Ukrainian workers are under the influence of Great Russian culture, we also know definitely that the ideas of Great Russian democracy and social democracy operate parallel with the Great Russian clerical and bourgeois culture. In fighting the latter kind of, quote, culture, the Ukrainian Marxist will always bring the former into focus, say to his workers, quote, "We must snatch at, make use of, and develop to the utmost every opportunity for intercourse with the Great Russian class-conscious workers, with their literature and with their range of ideas, the fundamental interests of both the Ukrainian and the Great Russian working-class movements demand it," unquote. If a Ukrainian Marxist allows himself to be swayed by his quite legitimate and natural hatred of the Great Russian oppressors to such a degree that he transfers even a particle of this hatred, even if it be only estrangement, to the proletarian culture and proletarian cause of the Great Russian workers, then such a Marxist will get bogged down in bourgeois nationalism. Similarly, the Great Russian Marxist will be bogged down not only in bourgeois, but also in Black Hundred nationalism, if he loses sight, even for a moment, of the demand for complete equality for the Ukrainians, or of their right to form an independent state. The Great Russian and Ukrainian workers must work together, and as long as they live in a single state, act in the closest organizational unity and concert toward a common or international culture of the proletarian movement, displaying absolute tolerance in the question of the language in which propaganda is conducted, and in the purely local or purely national details of that propaganda. This is the imperative demand of Marxism. All advocacy of the segregation of the workers of one nation from those of another, all attacks upon Marxist assimilation, or attempts where the proletariat is concerned to contrapose one national culture as a whole to another allegedly integral national culture and so forth, is bourgeois nationalism, against which it is essential to wage a ruthless struggle. So that's the end of Chapter 3. Now going on to Chapter 4, Cultural National Autonomy. The question of the national culture slogan is of enormous importance to Marxists, not only because it determines the ideological content of all our propaganda and agitation on the national question, as distinct from bourgeois propaganda, but also because the entire program of the much-discussed cultural national autonomy is based on this slogan. The main and fundamental flaw in this program is that it aims at introducing the most refined, most absolute, and most extreme nationalism. The gist of this program is that every citizen registers as belonging to a particular nation, and every nation constitutes a legal entity with the right to impose compulsory taxation on its members, with national parliaments or diets and national secretaries of state or ministers. Such an idea, applied to the national question, resembles Proudhon's idea, as applied to capitalism, not abolishing capitalism and its basis, commodity production, but purging that basis of abuses, of excrescences, and so forth. Not abolishing exchange and exchange value, but on the contrary, making it, quote, constitutional, universal, absolute, quote, fair, and free of fluctuations, crises, and abuses. Such was Proudhon's idea. Just as Proudhon was petty bourgeois, and his theory converted exchange and commodity production into an absolute category and exalted them as the acme of perfection, so is the theory and program of cultural national autonomy petty bourgeois, for it converts bourgeois nationalism into an absolute category, exalts it as the acme of perfection, and purges it of violence, injustice, etc. Marxism cannot be reconciled with nationalism, be it even of the most just, quote, purest, most refined, and civilized brand. In place of all forms of nationalism, Marxism advances internationalism, the amalgamation of all nations in the higher unity, a unity that is growing before our eyes with every mile of railway line that is built, with every international trust, and every workers' association that is formed, an association that is international in its economic activities as well as in its ideas and aims. The principle of nationality is historically inevitable in bourgeois society, and taking this society into due account, the Marxist fully recognizes the historical legitimacy of national movements. But to prevent this recognition from becoming an apologia of nationalism, it must be strictly limited to what is progressive in such movements, in order that this recognition may not lead to bourgeois ideology obscuring proletarian consciousness. The awakening of the masses from feudal lethargy and their struggle against all national oppression for the sovereignty of the people, of the nation, are progressive. Hence, it is the Marxists' bounden duty to stand for the most resolute and consistent democratism on all aspects of the national question. This task is largely a negative one, but this is the limit the proletariat can go to in supporting nationalism, for beyond that begins the positive activity of the bourgeoisie, striving to fortify nationalism. So let's pause there for a second for a comment, because I think that this is a key concept with some nuance that deserves accentuation. So going back over the past 3 paragraphs, Lenin says Marxism cannot be reconciled with nationalism, even if it's, a highly civilized, pure form, whatever. No, none of that. Marxism is for internationalism, the amalgamation of all nations in a higher unity, which is being built by capitalism, but which ultimately serves socialism really more than capitalism. This is another example of capitalism digging its own grave. Capitalism proletarianizes the population, which creates a population which is overwhelmingly, percentage-wise, interested in the abolition of private property. In other words, the basis of capitalism. So in that way, capitalism digs its own grave. In this way also, early capitalism forms nation states, and in that way moves on from feudalism. However, in all of its international commerce, it develops this internationalism, which really is at odds with the nation state itself. Yet more evidence that capitalism, however powerful it has been during various phases of its lifespan, is a transitional form from one thing to another. All right, so in the second paragraph, Lenin emphasizes that the principle of nationality is historically inevitable in bourgeois society. This is a thing that bourgeois society must create. And recognizing that bourgeois society, capitalism, needs to happen in terms of reaching socialism, this is a necessary step along the social development timeline, then Lenin says, okay, well then in that case, Marxists need to recognize, quote, the historical legitimacy of national movements, because if the bourgeoisie doesn't do this, if they don't overthrow feudalism and build bourgeois nation states, we're never going to have socialism. So, okay, fine. But as Lenin says, quote, to prevent this recognition, which should just be a neutral recognition, from becoming an apologia of nationalism, like endorsing bourgeois nationalism as like an inherent good, rather than just a relative good over feudalism and, not just a link in the chain towards socialism. Then, quote, it must be strictly limited to what is progressive in such movements, in order that this recognition may not lead to bourgeois ideology obscuring proletarian consciousness. So what does that mean? Lenin's saying that we're trying to look at bourgeois nationalism from Marxist, proletarian eyes. So we're trying to apply a proletarian consciousness to say, what about bourgeois development is necessary in terms of historical progress? And the answer is basically there is a certain time period where the bourgeoisie is ready to overthrow feudalism and move society forward from the relatively backward state of feudalism into capitalism, but that the proletariat is not yet sufficiently developed to go into socialism. Therefore, for some amount of time, whatever it is for that society, there is this necessary period of capitalism. Why is it necessary? For all the reasons we were talking about before. Capitalists build the bourgeois nation state. The bourgeois nation state then engages in all kinds of internationalism, proletarianizes the population, lays the groundwork for socialism. So in that process, bourgeois society develops bourgeois nationalism. What Lenin is saying is that Marxists should recognize and appreciate that bourgeois nationalism for what it is, a necessary step out of feudalism through capitalism into socialism, but that it itself is not somewhere that you want to park yourself. What's going to happen if you do? Then you run the risk of bourgeois ideology obscuring proletarian or socialist consciousness. Because if you lose that class consciousness, you're not going to be fighting for socialism. So that's the idea. We want to hang on to that. So what's Lenin's prescription for avoiding that? He says, quote, to prevent this recognition of bourgeois nationalism from becoming an apologia, a generalized justification and defense of it in all of its aspects, then Marxists must strictly limit our recognition and acknowledgement of bourgeois culture to what is progressive about it. And if you don't just limit yourself to saying, well, bourgeois culture is progressive in that it was a step out of feudalism and it's laying the groundwork for socialism, and you start getting into just the stuff itself, well, then you're just drinking bourgeois ideology at that point, and that may cloud your class consciousness. So you don't want to do that. Hopefully that's clear. So the third paragraph is the awakening of the masses from feudal lethargy and their struggle against all national oppression for the sovereignty of the people, of the nation, are progressive. So Lenin is saying here, these are a few other things that Marxists can say about bourgeois culture that are improvements on feudalism. That although socialism is going to be an improvement even over these are some of the foundations of what we're going to be doing in socialism. These are improvements that capitalism actually brings over feudalism that socialism will continue to improve on over what's possible within capitalism. So again, they are the awakening of the masses from feudal lethargy, because in feudalism, not a whole lot's possible. Not a lot of education, not a lot of acculturation, various things. And struggle against national oppression. So this is one of the things about this topic that a lot of the readings we're doing right now are going to be on, which is national rights against national oppression, national struggles, things like that. Because definitely there is such a thing as national oppression. To some extent, the development of the bourgeois nation state can be resistance against national oppression. However, all of the bourgeois nation state borders eventually, as Lenin says, are softened by the internationalism that capitalism itself creates through international trade. And, capitalists want there to be very free and open trade. So at some point, the bourgeois national state borders become really challenged by that, and they do start to wear down. The remedy for these not to just turn back into national oppression is socialist revolution, right? Because under 20th century capitalism, which was imperialism, capitalism was no longer this buoyant, progressive force uplifting nations out of national oppression and so forth. It turned into imperialism. So imperialism then, through the eradication of borders, or at least the weakening of borders between capitalist countries, can turn back into a very oppressive situation. And this is where, some kinds of like nationalists, right-wing nationalists, can seem like, oh, we're defending our people against this oppression or that oppression. And in some colonial situations, it's a little bit different. But, in general, the more advanced nations, that kind of nationalism, resisting globalism, this sounds like Alex Jones, it's because it is. That's a reactionary solution, in other words, to the kinds of national border softening that is created by capitalism itself, the same thing that created the nation state. So if that's the reactionary solution, quote unquote, which is not really a solution, it's very temporary, requires a huge amount of force to maintain, etc., then the progressive solution, again, is socialist revolution. Because then you can work in a more internationalist spirit, extending proletarian democracy and international cooperation. That way, the softening of the borders actually becomes a help rather than a contradiction and a source of conflict, as it is under capitalism. So finishing out that third and final paragraph, Lenin says, hence, it is the Marxists' bounden duty, this is fundamental, to stand for the most resolute and consistent democratism on all aspects of the national question. Okay, so the purpose of the Marxist here is to try to guide this process towards maximal democracy at all times, to accentuate the progressive characteristics of the struggle that goes on under capitalism. However, Lenin adds, this is the limit that the proletariat can go to in supporting nationalism, what he calls largely a negative task. For beyond that, if Marxists are to do any more, then you cross over into the positive activity of the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie is striving to, as Lenin says, fortify nationalism. Lenin here is drawing a clear line. The proletariat does not want to fortify nationalism. This is a product of the bourgeoisie, which is meant to basically have capitalism hold on for as long as it can. It's part of the bourgeoisie's struggle against the proletariat. Remember, there's an early phase to capitalism when capitalism is ascendant and fighting with the feudalists. Then there is the second half, after the feudalists have been put down and capitalism is trying to maintain its rule and oppression of the proletariat. This is the point where the proletariat now assumes the position that the bourgeoisie used to be in. Just as the bourgeoisie threw off the feudalists, the proletariat is trying to throw off the bourgeoisie. This is definitely the point where the proletariat, the proletariat, are no longer trying to cooperate with the bourgeoisie. Their task is over. Now it's our task to get rid of them and continue social progress, which the bourgeoisie has already fulfilled as much as they possibly can. All right, hopefully that's clear. Let's continue with the text. To throw off the feudal yoke, all national oppression, and all privileges enjoyed by any particular nation or language is the imperative duty of the proletariat as a democratic force, and is certainly in the interests of the proletarian class struggle, which is obscured and retarded by bickering on the national question. But to go beyond these strictly limited and definite historical limits in helping bourgeois nationalism means betraying the proletariat and siding with the bourgeoisie. There is a borderline here which is often very slight, in which the Bundists and Ukrainian nationalist socialists completely lose sight of. Combat all national oppression? Yes, of course. Fight for any kind of national development, for, quote, national culture in general? Of course not. The economic development of capitalist society presents us with examples of immature national movements all over the world, examples of the formation of big nations out of a number of small ones, or to the detriment of some of the small ones, and also examples of the assimilation of nations. The development of nationality in general is the principle of bourgeois nationalism, hence the exclusiveness of bourgeois nationalism, hence the endless national bickering. The proletariat, however, far from undertaking to uphold the national development of every nation, on the contrary, warns the masses against such illusions, stands for the fullest freedom of capitalist intercourse, and welcomes every kind of assimilation of nations, except that which is founded on force or privilege. So I got a comment there again. Let's read that sentence again. The proletariat, however, far from undertaking to uphold the national development of every nation, on the contrary, warns the masses against such illusions, stands for the fullest freedom of capitalist intercourse, and welcomes every kind of assimilation of nations, except that which is founded on force or privilege. So, what kind of assimilation of nations is founded on force or privilege? I'm just going to leave it there for right now. Continuing. Consolidating nationalism within a certain, quote, justly delimited sphere, constitutionalizing nationalism, and securing the separation of all nations from one another by means of a special state institution, such as the ideological foundation and content of cultural national autonomy. This idea is thoroughly bourgeois and thoroughly false. The proletariat cannot support any consecration of nationalism. On the contrary, it supports everything that helps to obliterate national distinctions and remove national barriers. It supports everything that makes the ties between nationalities closer and closer, or tends to merge nations. To act differently means siding with reactionary nationalist Philistinism. That's what I was talking about before. When, at their Congress in Brunn in 1899, the Austrian Social Democrats discussed the plan for cultural national autonomy, practically no attention was paid to a theoretical appraisal of that plan. There's a footnote here. This refers to the Congress of the Austrian Social Democratic Party, held in Brunn, Austria, from September 24 to 29, 1899. The national question was the chief item on the agenda. Two resolutions expressing different points of view were submitted to the Congress. One, the resolution of the party's Central Committee supporting the idea of the territorial autonomy of nations, and two, the resolution of the Committee of the South Slav Social Democratic Party supporting the idea of extraterritorial cultural national autonomy. The Congress unanimously rejected the program of cultural national autonomy and adopted a compromise resolution recognizing national autonomy within the boundaries of the Austrian state. Back to the main text. It is, however, noteworthy that the following two arguments were leveled against this program. One, it would tend to strengthen clericalism, and two, quote, its result would be the perpetuation of chauvinism, its introduction into every small community, into every small group, unquote. A Russian translation was published by the Jewish Nationalist Party, the JSLP. There's a footnote there. The JSLP, or the Jewish Socialist Labor Party, was a petty bourgeois nationalist organization founded in 1906. Its program was based on the demand for national autonomy for the Jews, the creation of extraterritorial Jewish parliaments authorized to settle questions concerning the political organization of Jews in Russia. The JSLP stood close to the socialist revolutionaries, with whom it waged a struggle against the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. So, quick comment there. The socialist revolutionaries, this is not just a descriptive term, it was the name of a faction that was distinct from the Bolsheviks. Back to the main text. There can be no doubt that national culture, in the ordinary sense of the term, i.e. schools, etc., is at present under the predominant influence of the clergy and the bourgeois chauvinists in all countries in the world. When the Bundists, in advocating cultural national autonomy, say that the constituting of nations will keep the class struggle within them clean of all extraneous considerations, then that is manifest and ridiculous sophistry. It is primarily in the economic and political sphere that a serious class struggle is waged in any capitalist society. To separate the sphere of education from this is firstly absurdly utopian, because schools, like national culture in general, cannot be separated from economics and politics. Secondly, it is the economic and political life of a capitalist country that necessitates, at every step, the smashing of the absurd and outmoded national barriers and prejudices, whereas separation of the school system and the like would only perpetuate, intensify, and strengthen, quote, pure clericalism and, quote, pure bourgeois chauvinism. On the boards of the joint stock companies, we find capitalists of different nations sitting together in complete harmony. At the factories, workers of different nations work side by side. In any really serious and profound political issue, sides are taken according to classes, not nations. Withdrawing school education and the like from state control and placing it under the control of the nations is, in effect, an attempt to separate from economics, which unites the nations, the most highly, so to speak, ideological sphere of social life, the sphere in which pure national culture, or the national cultivation of clericalism and chauvinism, has the freest play. In practice, the plan for extraterritorial, or cultural national autonomy could mean only one thing: the division of educational affairs according to nationality, i.e. the introduction of national curias in school affairs. Sufficient thought to the real significance of the famous Bund plan will enable one to realize how utterly reactionary it is, even from the standpoint of democracy, let alone from that of the proletarian class struggle for socialism. A single instance and a single scheme for the nationalization of the school system will make this point abundantly clear. In the United States of America, the division of the states into northern and southern holds to this day in all departments of life. The former possess the greatest traditions of freedom and of struggle against the slave owners. The latter possess the greatest traditions of slave ownership, survivals of persecution of the Negroes who are economically oppressed and culturally backward. 44% of Negroes are illiterate, but only 6% of whites, and so forth. In the northern states, Negro children attend the same schools as white children do. In the South, there are separate national, or racial, whichever you please, schools for Negro children. I think that this is the sole instance of actual nationalizations of schools. Comment, in other words, it's the legacy and remnant of a backward, prejudicial condition. In Eastern Europe, there exists a country where things like the Bilas case are still possible. Footnote there, the Bilas case was a provocative trial engineered by the Tsarist government in 1913 in Kiev. Bilas, a Jew, was falsely accused of having murdered a Christian boy named Yushchinsky for ritual purposes. Actually, the murder was organized by the Black Hundreds. The aim of the frame-up was to fan anti-Semitism and incite pogroms so as to divert the masses from the mounting revolutionary movement. Boy, does this sound familiar. The trial excited great public feeling. Workers' protest demonstrations were held in a number of cities. Bylus was acquitted. And commenting, while we're on the subject of anti-black discrimination, prejudice, slavery, continuing on in the legacy of the former Confederacy in the United States, remember, of course, that this has been common here too, both back in the days of the KKK, which targeted black people, Jewish people, and to some extent Catholics, particularly in areas where there weren't as many black people or Jewish people to scapegoat for whatever kind of issues the capitalists were having. That really is what it's all about. It's scapegoating, diverting attention, diverting calls for social justice and social change into some kind of racial struggle, some other kind of national, ethnic-oriented sort of conflict. The essence of fascism, in my opinion, is trying to divert revolutionary energy coming from class struggle towards some kind of conflict that serves the status quo. In other words, turning class struggle into race struggle, for example. See the Understanding Fascism playlist at the S4A channel for more on this. Back to the main text. And Jews are condemned by the Purishkeviches to a condition worse than that of the Negroes. In that country, a scheme for nationalizing Jewish schools was recently mooted in the ministry. Happily, this reactionary utopia is no more likely to be realized than the utopia of the Austrian petty bourgeoisie, who have despaired of achieving consistent democracy or of putting an end to national bickering, and have invented for the nations school education compartments to keep them from bickering over the distribution of schools, but have constituted themselves for an external bickering of one national culture with another. In Austria, the idea of cultural national autonomy has remained largely a flight of literary fancy, which the Austrian Social Democrats themselves have not taken seriously. In Russia, however, it has been incorporated in the programs of all the Jewish bourgeois parties, and of several petty bourgeois opportunist elements in the different nations, for example, the Bundists, the liquidators in the Caucasus, and the Conference of Russian Parties of the Left Narodnik or populist trend. Parentheses, this conference, we will mention parenthetically, took place in 1907, its decision being adopted with abstention on the part of the Russian Socialist Revolutionaries and the PSP, or the Polish Social Patriots. Abstention from voting is a method surprisingly characteristic of the Socialist Revolutionaries and PSP when they want to show their attitude toward a most important question of principle in the sphere of the national program. There's a couple of footnotes there. The Socialist Revolutionaries, I mentioned before, were a petty bourgeois party in Russia, which came into being at the end of 1901 and beginning of 1902 as a result of a merger of various Narodnik, again populist, groups and circles. The SRs saw no class distinctions between the proletarian and the petty proprietor, played down the class differentiation and antagonisms within the peasantry, and refused to recognize the proletariat's leading role in the revolution. Their views were an eclectic mixture of the ideas of narratism and revisionism. In Lenin's words, they tried to mend the rents in the Narodnik ideas with bits of fashionable opportunist, quote, criticism of Marxism. The Socialist Revolutionaries' agrarian program envisaged the abolition of private ownership of the land, which was to be transferred to the village commune on the basis of the labor principle and equalized land tenure, and also the development of cooperatives. This program, which the SRs called socialization of the land, had nothing socialist about it. In his analysis of this program, Lenin showed that the preservation of commodity production and private farming on communal land would not do away with the domination of capital or would not free the toiling peasantry from exploitation and impoverishment. Neither could the cooperatives be a remedy for the small farmers under capitalism, as they served only to enrich the rural bourgeoisie. At the same time, as Lenin pointed out, the demand for equalized land tenure though not socialistic, was of a progressive, revolutionary democratic character, inasmuch as it was directed against reactionary landlordism. The Bolshevik Party exposed the attempts of the SR to pass themselves off as socialists. It waged a stubborn fight against them for influence over the peasantry, and revealed the damage that their tactic of individual terrorism was causing to the working class movement. At the same time, the Bolsheviks, on definite terms, entered into temporary agreements with the socialist revolutionaries to combat Tsarism. The Socialist Revolutionary Party's political and ideological instability and organizational incohesion, as well as its constant vacillation between the liberal bourgeoisie and the proletariat, were due to the absence of class homogeneity among the peasantry. So just a comment there, that's the second mention of class stratification in the peasantry. There are poor peasants, there are middle peasants, there are rich peasants. You can even, in some cases, break it down further. For a really good example of this, look at Mao's 1933 text, How to Differentiate the Classes in the Rural Areas. We have that on the channel. But yeah, peasants are not all equal in terms of class standing. Continuing. During the First Russian Revolution, the right wing of the SRs broke away from the party and formed the legal Labor Popular Socialist Party, whose views were close to those of the Constitutional Democrats, or Cadets. That was a bourgeois party. While the left wing split away and formed a semi-anarchist league of Maximalists. During the period of the Stolypin reaction, the Socialist Revolutionary Party suffered a complete breakdown ideologically and organizationally. During the First World War, most of its members took a social chauvinist stand. After the February bourgeois democratic revolution of 1917, the Socialist Revolutionaries, together with the Mensheviks and the Cadets, were the mainstay of the counter-revolutionary provisional government of the bourgeoisie and landlords. The leaders of the SR Party, Kerensky, Avksentiev, and Chernov, were members of this cabinet. The SR Party refused to support the peasants' demand for the abolition of landlordism and stood for the preservation of landlord ownership. The SR members of the provisional government authorized punitive action against peasants who had seized landed estates. So, quick comment there. This is what happened between the February 1917 revolution, where the Tsar was deposed in Russia, and the October Revolution, also of 1917, when the Bolsheviks, really just later that year, about 9 months later, overthrew the bourgeoisie, which was trying to set up a provisional government. Part of what was happening in that process is that the cadets, basically representing the bourgeoisie, were joined by the Mensheviks, today's Socdems, and the socialist revolutionaries, these kind of petty bourgeois radlibs. And basically all of these, sometimes former allies of the Bolsheviks were just sidling up to the bourgeoisie. And as you can see, they were taking actions really in support of some of the worst elements of capitalism. And the key thing here being at a time when socialist revolution was within the grasp of the proletariat-peasantry alliance. Utter betrayal there at just a totally pivotal moment. Anyway, continuing. At the end of November 1917, the left wing of the SR Party formed an independent party of left socialist revolutionaries, who, in an endeavor to preserve their influence among the peasant masses, formally recognized Soviet rule and entered into an agreement with the Bolsheviks. Shortly, however, they began a struggle against the Soviets. And Soviets just means council, so these were councils of the workers, peasants, and soldiers' deputies. They formed the basis, of course, of the new socialist government. Continuing, during the years of foreign intervention and the Civil War, this was 1917 to 1922 basically, when the capitalists were still fighting to try to get, quote, their stuff back, the socialist revolutionaries carried on counter-revolutionary, anti-Soviet, subversive activities. They actively supported the interventionists and the White Guards. They took part in counter-revolutionary plots, and they organized terroristic raids against leaders of the Soviet state and the Communist Party. After the Civil War, the socialist revolutionaries continued their anti-Soviet activities within the country and in the camp of the white émigrés. So So that's the Socialist Revolutionaries. Now on to the Polish Socialist Party. This was a reformist nationalist organization founded in 1892, adopting the slogan of struggle for an independent Poland. The PSP, under Pilsudski and his adherents, carried on separatist nationalist propaganda among the Polish workers, whom they tried to divert from the joint struggle with the Russian workers against the autocracy and capitalism. Throughout the history of the PSP, left-wing groups kept springing up within the party as a result of the activities of the rank-and-file workers. Some of these groups eventually joined the revolutionary wing of the Polish working-class movement. In 1906, the party split up into the PSP left wing and the right chauvinist wing, the so-called, quote, revolutionary faction. Under the influence of the Bolsheviks and the Social Democratic Party of Poland and Lithuania, the left wing gradually adopted a consistent revolutionary stand. During the First World War, some of the PSP left wing adopted an internationalist stand. In December 1918, it united with the Social Democrats of Poland and Lithuania to form the Communist Workers' Party of Poland, as the Communist Party of Poland was known up to 1925. During the First World War, the PSP right wing continued its policy of national chauvinism, organizing Polish legions on the territory of Galicia to fight on the side of Austrian German imperialism. With the formation of the Polish bourgeois state, the right PSP in 1919 united with the PSP organizations existing on Polish territories formerly seized by Germany and Austria, and resumed the name of the PSP. At the head of the government, it arranged for the transfer of power to the Polish bourgeoisie, systematically carried on anti-communist propaganda, and supported a policy of aggression against the Soviet Union, a policy of conquest and oppression against Western Ukraine and Western Byelorussia. Various groups in the PSP who disagreed with this policy joined the Communist Party of Poland. After Pilsudski's fascist coup d'etat, May 1926, the PSP was nominally a parliamentary opposition, but actually it did not carry on any active fight against the fascist regime, and continued its anti-communist and anti-Soviet propaganda. During that period, the left-wing elements of the PSP collaborated with the Polish communists and supported United Front tactics in a number of campaigns. During the Second World War, the PSP again split up. Its reactionary and chauvinist faction, which assumed the name Liberty, Equality, Independence, took part in the reactionary Polish émigré, quote, government in London. The left faction, which called itself the Workers' Party of Polish Socialists, under the influence of the Polish Workers' Party, which was founded in 1942, joined the Popular Front against the Nazi invaders, fought for Poland's liberation, and pursued a policy of friendly relations with the USSR. In 1944, after the liberation of Poland's eastern territories and the formation of a Polish Committee of National Liberation, the Workers' Party of Polish Socialists resumed the name of PSP, and together with the PWP, participated in the building up of a People's Democratic Poland. In December 1948, the PWP and the PSP amalgamated and formed the Polish United Workers' Party. Okay, two very long footnotes. Now let's get back to the main text. In Austria, it was Otto Bauer, the principal theoretician of cultural national autonomy, who devoted a special chapter of his book to prove that such a program cannot possibly be proposed for the Jews. In Russia, however, it is precisely among the Jews that all the bourgeois parties, and the Bund, which echoes them, have adopted this program. What does this go to show? It goes to show that history, through the political practice of another state, has exposed the absurdity of Bauer's invention, in exactly the same way as the Russian Bernsteinians, Struve, Tugen-Baranovsky, Berdayev and company, through their rapid evolution from Marxism to liberalism, have exposed the real ideological content of the German Bernsteinism. There's two footnotes there. First, that the Bundists often vehemently deny that all the Jewish bourgeois parties have accepted, quote, cultural national autonomy is understandable. This fact only too glaringly exposes the actual role being played by the Bund. When Mr. Lenin, a Bundist, tried, in Lutsch, to repeat his denial, He was fully exposed by N. Skop. And there's a footnote there. Luch was, or the Ray, was a legal daily of the Menshevik liquidators. It was published in St. Petersburg from September 16, 1912 to July 5, 1913. It put out 237 issues. The newspaper was maintained chiefly by contributions from the liberals. Ideological leadership was in the bands of P.B. Axelrod, F.I. Don, L. Martov, and A.S. Martinov. The liquidators used the columns of this newspaper to oppose the revolutionary tactics of the Bolsheviks, advocate the opportunist slogan of an open party, attack the revolutionary mass strikes of the workers, and attempt to revise the most important points of the party program. Lenin wrote that Luch was, quote, enslaved by a liberal policy and called the paper a mouthpiece of the renegades. That's the end of that footnote. Back to the first footnote. But when Mr. Lev Yurkovich, in Jvin, 1913, numbers 7 through 8, quotes from Prozveshchenia, NSK's statement that, quote, the Bundists, together with all the Jewish bourgeois parties and groups, have long been advocating cultural national autonomy, and distorts this statement by dropping the word Bundists and substituting the words national rights for the words cultural national autonomy, one can only raise one's hands in amazement. Mr. Lev Yurkovich is not only a nationalist, not only an astonishing ignoramus in matters concerning the history of the Social Democrats and their program, but a downright falsifier of quotations for the benefit of the Bund. The affairs of the Bund and the Yurkoviches must be in a bad way indeed. That was a note from Lenin. Then the second footnote is on Bernsteinism. This was an anti-Marxist trend in international social democracy. Lenin refers to it a lot. It arose toward the close of the 19th century in Germany and bore the name of the German opportunist social democrat Edward Bernstein. After the death of Friedrich Engels, Bernstein publicly advocated revision of Marx's revolutionary theory in the spirit of bourgeois liberalism. See his article, Problems of Socialism, and his book, The Premises of Socialism and Tasks of Social Democracy, in an attempt to convert the Social Democratic Party into a petty bourgeois party of social reforms. In Russia, this trend was represented by the legal Marxists, the economists, the Bundists, and the Mensheviks. Back to the main text. Neither the Austrian nor the Russian Social Democrats have incorporated cultural national autonomy in their program. However, the Jewish bourgeois parties in a most backward country, and a number of petty bourgeois so-called socialist groups, have adopted it in order to spread ideas of bourgeois nationalism among the working class in a refined form. This fact speaks for itself. Since we have had to touch upon the Austrian program on the national question, we must reassert a truth which is often distorted by the Bundists. At the Brünn Congress, a pure program of cultural national autonomy was presented. This was the program of the South Slav Social Democrats, Section 2 of which reads, every nation living in Austria, irrespective of the territory occupied by its members, constitutes an autonomous group which manages all its national, that is language and cultural, affairs quite independently, unquote. This program was supported not only by Christan but by the influential Ellen Bogen, but it was withdrawn. Not a single vote was cast for it. A territorialist program was adopted, i.e. one that did not create any national groups, quote, irrespective of the territory occupied by the members of the nation, unquote. Clause 3 of the adopted program reads, quote, the self-governing regions of one and the same nation shall jointly form a nationally united association, which shall manage its national affairs on an absolutely autonomous basis, unquote. There's a footnote there. Here, Lenin is referring to Stalin's article, Marxism and the National Question, published in the legal Bolshevik journal Prozveshchenia, numbers 3, 4, and 5, for 1913, under the title, The National Question and Social Democracy. Chapter 4 of Stalin's article quotes the text of the national program adopted at the Brünn Congress of the Austrian Social Democratic Party. Back to the main text. Clearly, this compromise program is wrong too. An example will illustrate this. The German colonists' community in Saratov gubernia, plus the German working-class suburb of Riga or Lodz, plus the German housing estate near St. Petersburg, etc., would constitute a, quote, nationally united association of Germans in Russia. Obviously, the Social Democrats cannot demand such a thing or enforce such an association, although of course they do not in the least deny freedom of every kind of association, including associations of any communities of any nationality in a given state. The segregation, by a law of the state, of Germans, etc., in different localities and of different classes in Russia, into a single German national association, may be practiced by anybody, priests, bourgeois, or Philistines, but not by Social Democrats, i.e. Marxists. So that's the end of Chapter 4. Now moving on to Chapter 5, the equality of nations and the rights of national minorities. When they discuss the national question, opportunists in Russia are given to citing the example of Austria. In my article in Severnaya Pravda, the one that's quoted at the beginning of this text, which the opportunists have attacked, Mr. Semkovsky in Novaya Robochaya Gazeta and Mr. Liebman in Zeit, I asserted that, insofar as that is at all possible under capitalism, there was only one solution of the national question, viz., through consistent democracy. In proof of this, I referred, among other things, to Switzerland. Quick footnote there, Novaya Robochaya Gazeta, or the New Workers' Paper, was a legal daily newspaper of the Menshevik liquidators, published in St. Petersburg from August 1913. From January 30th, 1914, it was superseded by Severnaya Robochaya Gazeta, Northern Workers' Paper, and subsequently by Nasha Robochaya Gazeta, Our Workers' Paper. Lenin repeatedly referred to this newspaper as the Novaya Likvidatorskaya Gazeta, or New Liquidationist Paper. Back to the main text. This has not been to the liking of the two opportunists mentioned above, who are trying to refute it or belittle its significance. Kautsky, we're told, said that Switzerland is an exception. Switzerland, if you please, has a special kind of decentralization, a special history, special geographical conditions, unique distribution of a population that speak different languages, etc., etc. All these are nothing more than attempts to evade the issue. To be sure, Switzerland is an exception in that she is not a single nation state, but Austria and Russia are also exceptions, or are backward, as Kautsky adds. To be sure, it was only her special, unique historical and social conditions that ensured Switzerland greater democracy than most of her European neighbors. But where does all this come in, if we're speaking of the model to be adopted? In the whole world, under present-day conditions, countries in which any particular institution has been founded on consistent democratic principles are the exception. Does this prevent us in our program from upholding consistent democracy in all institutions? Switzerland's special features lie in her history, her geographical and other conditions. Russia's special features lie in the strength of her proletariat, which has no precedent in the epoch of bourgeois revolutions, and in her shocking general backwardness, which objectively necessitates an exceptionally rapid and resolute advance under the threat of all sorts of drawbacks and reverses. We are evolving a national program from the proletarian standpoint. Since when has it been recommended that the worst examples, rather than the best, be taken as a model? At all events, does it not remain an indisputable and undisputed fact that national peace under capitalism has been achieved, insofar as it is achievable, exclusively in countries where consistent democracy prevails? Since this is indisputable, the opportunists' persistent references to Austria instead of Switzerland are nothing but a typical cadet device, for the cadets always copy the worst European constitutions rather than the best. There's a footnote there. The cadets were members of the Constitutional Democratic Party, the principal party of the liberal monarchist bourgeoisie in Russia. It was formed in October 1905 and consisted of representatives of the bourgeoisie, landlord members of the Zemstvos, and bourgeois intellectuals. Prominent leaders of the cadets were P.N. Milyakov, S.A. Muromtsev, V.A. Maklakov, A.I. Shingaryov, P.B. Struve, and F.I. Rodachev. To mislead the masses, the cadets called themselves, quote, the Party of People's Freedom, but actually they went no further than the demand for a constitutional monarchy. They considered the fight against the revolutionary movement their chief aim, and strove to share power with the Tsar and the feudalist landlords. Quick comment, I just always think of the situation in the United States today where you have the Democrats, very similar to the cadets in this way. They want this, I mean, we don't have a monarchy in the United States, but the most backward reactionary neo-Confederate elements are obviously in the Republican Party, though it's not exclusively maybe to every last Republican, but pretty close. Anyway, the Democrats just want to share power with them, very similar to the way that the cadets just wanted to have a constitutional monarchy, and their principal aim was opposing the revolutionary left. That way, the struggle is centered on, oh, capitalism is better than feudalism, rather than actually, having to face what the future might hold, what is more progressive than them. It's not one-to-one, but similar dynamics, I would say. Continuing, during World War I, the cadets actively supported the Tsarist government's aggressive foreign policy, and during the February 1917 bourgeois democratic revolution, they tried to save the monarchy. Holding key posts in the bourgeois provisional government, the cadets pursued an anti-popular and counter-revolutionary policy. After the victory of the October Socialist Revolution, the cadets came out as the avowed enemies of Soviet rule, taking part in all armed counter-revolutionary acts and campaigns of the interventionists. Living abroad as émigrés after the defeat of the interventionists and White Guards, the cadets continued their anti-Soviet activities. Back to the main text. In Switzerland, there are 3 official languages, but bills submitted to a referendum are printed in 5 languages, that is to say, in 2 Romansh dialects, in addition to the 3 official languages. According to the 1900 census, these 2 dialects are spoken by 38,651 out of the 3.3 million inhabitants of Switzerland, i.e. by a little over 1%. In the army, commissioned and non-commissioned officers, quote, are given the fullest freedom to speak to the men in their native language, unquote. In the cantons of Graubünden and Wallis, each with a population of a little over 100,000, both dialects enjoy complete equality. There's a footnote there from Lenin, see René Henry, La Suisse et la question des langues, Bern, 1907. The question is, should we advocate and support this, the living experience of an advanced country, or borrow from the Austrians inventions like extraterritorial autonomy, which have not yet been tried out anywhere in the world, and have not yet been adopted by the Austrians themselves? To advocate this invention is to advocate the division of school education according to nationality. That is a downright harmful idea. The experience of Switzerland proves, however, that the greatest relative degree of national peace can be, and has been, ensured in practice where you have a consistent, again relative, within capitalism, democracy throughout the state. Quote, in Switzerland, say people who have studied this question, quote, there is no national question in the East European sense of the term. The very phrase, national question, is unknown there. Switzerland left the struggle between nationalities a long way behind in 1797 to 1803. There's a footnote there. Lenin says, see Ed Blocher, B-L-O-C-H-E-R, Die Nationalitäten in der Schweiz, Berlin, 1910. This means that the epoch of the Great French Revolution, which provided the most democratic solution of the current problems of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, succeeded incidentally, en passant, in, quote, solving the national question. Yet the Semkovskys, Liebmans, and other opportunists now try to assert that this, quote, exclusively Swiss solution is inapplicable to any uyezd or even part of an uyezd in Russia, where out of a population of only 200,000, 40,000 speak 2 dialects and want to have complete equality of language in their area. Advocacy of complete equality of nations and languages distinguishes only the consistently democratic elements in each nation, i.e. only the proletarians, and unites them, not according to nationality, but in a profound and earnest desire to improve the entire system of state. On the contrary, advocacy of cultural national autonomy, despite the pious wishes of individuals and groups, divides the nations, and in fact draws the workers and the bourgeoisie of any one nation closer together. The adoption of this cultural national autonomy by all the Jewish bourgeois parties. Guaranteeing the rights of a national minority is inseparably linked up with the principle of complete equality. In my article in Severnaya Pravda, this principle was expressed in almost the same terms as in the latter, official and more accurate decision of the Conference of Marxists. That decision demands, quote, the incorporation in the Constitution of a fundamental law which shall declare null and void all privileges enjoyed by any one nation and all infringements of the rights of a national minority, unquote. Mr. Liebman tries to ridicule this formula and asks, quote, who knows what the rights of a national minority are, unquote. Do these rights, he wants to know, include the right of the minority to have, quote, its own program for the national schools? How large must the national minority be to have the right to have its own judges, officials, and schools with instruction in its own language? Mr. Liebman wants it to be inferred from these questions that a, quote, positive national program is essential. Actually, these questions clearly show what reactionary ideas our Bundist tries to smuggle through under cover of a dispute on supposedly minor details and particulars. Quote, its own program in its national schools. Marxists, my dear National Socialist, have a general school program which demands, for example, an absolutely secular school. As far as Marxists are concerned, no departure from this general program is anywhere or at any time permissible in a democratic state. The question of introducing any local subjects, languages, and so forth into it being decided by the local inhabitants. However, from the principle of, quote, taking educational affairs out of the hands of the state and placing them under the control of the nations, it ensues that we, the workers, must allow the nations in our democratic state to spend the people's money on clerical schools. Without being aware of the fact, Mr. Liebman has clearly demonstrated the reactionary nature of cultural national autonomy. Quote, how large must a national minority be? This is not defined even in the Austrian program, of which the Bundists are enamored. It says, more briefly and less clearly than our program does, quote, the rights of the national minorities are protected by a special law to be passed by the imperial parliament, unquote. This is section 4 of the Bund program. Why has nobody asked the Austrian Social Democrats the question, what exactly is that law, and exactly which rights and of which minority is it to protect? That is because all sensible people understand that it is inappropriate and impossible to define particulars in a program. A program lays down only fundamental principles. In this case, the fundamental principle is implied with the Austrians and directly expressed in the decision of the latest conference of Russian Marxists. That principle is no national privileges and no national inequality. Let us take a concrete example to make the point clear to the Bundist. According to the school census of January 18, 1911, St. Petersburg elementary schools under the Ministry of Public Education were attended by 48,076 pupils. Of these, 396, i.e. less than 1%, were Jews. The other figures are Romanian pupils, 2, Georgians, 1, Armenians, 3, etc. There's a footnote there. Lenin obtained these figures from the Statistical Handbook, one-day census of elementary schools in the Empire, made on January 18, 1911. The citation goes on for a while. I'll let you look that up if you're interested in it. Back to the text. Is it possible to draw up a positive national program that will cover this diversity of relationships and conditions? And St. Petersburg is, of course, far from being the city with the most mixed population in Russia. Even such specialists in national subtleties as the Bundists would hardly be able to draw up such a program. And yet, if the constitution of the country contained a fundamental law rendering null and void every measure that infringed the rights of a minority, any citizen would be able to demand the rescinding of orders prohibiting, for example, the hiring at state expense of special teachers of Hebrew, Jewish history, and the like, or the provision of state-owned premises for lectures for Jewish, Armenian, or Romanian children, or even for the one Georgian child. At all events, it is by no means impossible to meet, on the basis of equality, all the reasonable and just wishes of the national minorities. And nobody will say that advocacy of equality is harmful. On the other hand, it would certainly be harmful to advocate division of schools according to nationality, to advocate, for example, special schools for Jewish children in St. Petersburg, and it would be utterly impossible to set up national schools for every national minority for 1, 2, or 3 children. Furthermore, it's impossible in every countrywide law to define how large a national minority must be to be entitled to special schools, or to special teachers for supplementary subjects, etc. On the other hand, a countrywide law establishing equality can be worked out in detail and developed through special regulations and the decisions of regional diets and town, zemstvo, village commune, and other authorities. So that's the end of section 5. Actually, this conversation and criticism carries over into section 6, beginning now, centralization and autonomy. In his rejoinder, Mr. Liebman writes, quote, "Take our Lithuania, the Baltic province, Poland, Volhynia, South Russia, etc. Everywhere you will find a mixed population. There's not a single city that does not have a large national minority. However far decentralization is carried out, different nationalities will always be found living together in different places, chiefly in urban communities, and it is democratism that surrenders a national minority to the national majority. But as we know, V.I. Lenin is opposed to the federal state structure and the boundless decentralization that exists in the Swiss Federation. The question is, what was his point in citing the example of Switzerland?" Unquote. My object in citing the example of Switzerland has already been explained above. I have also explained that the problem of protecting the rights of a national minority can be solved only by a countrywide law promulgated in a consistently democratic state that does not depart from the principle of equality. But in the passage quoted above, Mr. Liebman still repeats another of the most common and most fallacious arguments or skeptical remarks which are usually made against the Marxist national program, and which therefore deserve examination. Marxists are, of course, opposed to federation and decentralization for the simple reason that capitalism requires for its development the largest and most centralized possible states. Other conditions being equal, the class-conscious proletariat will always stand for the larger state. It will always fight against medieval particularism and will always welcome the closest possible economic amalgamation of large territories in which the proletariat's struggle against the bourgeoisie can develop on a broad basis. Capitalism's broad and rapid development of the productive forces calls for large, politically compact, and united territories, since only here can the bourgeois class, together with its inevitable antipode, the proletarian class, unite and sweep away all the old, medieval, caste, parochial, petty national, religious, and other barriers. The right of nations to self-determination, i.e. the right to secede and form independent national states, will be dealt with elsewhere. But while, and insofar as, different nations constitute a single state, Marxists will never, under any circumstances, advocate either the federal principle or decentralization. The great centralized state is a tremendous historical step forward from medieval disunity to the future socialist unity of the whole world, and only via such a state, inseparably connected with capitalism, can there be any road to socialism. Quick comment here, we just did an audiobook, Marx and Engels, on the Bakuninists in Spain. Go check that out if you want some examples of the federal principle or decentralization in practice, which was advocated by the Bakuninist anarchists during the Spanish bourgeois revolution against feudalism in the late 1860s and early 1870s, and what a complete and absolute mess they made out of any potential push for socialism during that time by completely disuniting the proletarian forces, which allowed the bourgeoisie to conquer them with just a handful of troops. Really, really terrible stuff. Anyway, continuing. It would, however, be inexcusable to forget that in advocating centralism, we advocate exclusively democratic centralism. On this point, all the Philistines in general, and the nationalist Philistines in particular, including the late Dragomanov, have so confused the issue that we are obliged again and again to spend time clarifying it. There's a footnote there. MP Dragomanov, 1841 to 1895, was a Ukrainian historian, ethnographer, and publicist. He was an exponent of Ukrainian bourgeois national liberalism. Now back to the clarification. Far from precluding local self-government, with autonomy for regions having special economic and social conditions, a distinct national composition of the population, and so forth. Democratic centralism necessarily demands both. In Russia, centralism is constantly confused with tyranny and bureaucracy. This confusion has naturally arisen from the history of Russia, but even so, it's quite inexcusable for a Marxist to yield to it. This can best be explained by a concrete example. In her lengthy article, The National Question and Autonomy, covered on this channel, Rosa Luxemburg, among many other curious errors, which we shall deal with below, commits the exceptionally curious one of trying to restrict the demand for autonomy to Poland alone. But first, let us see how she defines autonomy. Rosa Luxemburg admits, and being a Marxist, she is of course bound to admit, that all the major and important economic and political questions of capitalist society must be dealt with exclusively by the central parliament of the whole country concerned, not by the autonomous diets of the individual regions. These questions include tariff policy, laws governing commerce and industry, transport and means of communication, railways, post, telegraph, telephone, etc., the army, the taxation system, civil and criminal law, the general principles of education, for example, the law on purely secular schools, on universal education, on the minimum program, on democratic school management, etc., the labor protection laws, and political liberties, right of association, etc., etc. There's a footnote there on civil law. In elaborating her ideas, Rosa Luxemburg goes into details, boy I'll say, mentioning, for example, and quite rightly, divorce laws. Back to the main text. The autonomous diets, on the basis of the general laws of the country, should deal with questions of purely local, regional, or national significance. Amplifying this idea in great, not to say excessive, detail, Rosa Luxemburg mentions, for example, the construction of local railways and local highways, etc. Obviously, one cannot conceive of a modern, truly democratic state that did not grant such autonomy to every region, having any appreciably distinct economic and social features, populations of a specific national composition, etc. The principle of centralism, which is essential for the development of capitalism, is not violated by this local and regional autonomy, but on the contrary, is applied by it democratically, not bureaucratically. The broad, free, and rapid development of capitalism would be impossible, or at least greatly impeded, by the absence of such autonomy, which facilitates the concentration of capital, the development of the productive forces, the unity of the bourgeoisie, and the unity of the proletariat on a country-wide scale. For bureaucratic interference in purely local, regional, national, and other questions is one of the greatest obstacles to economic and political development in general, and an obstacle to centralism in serious, important, and fundamental matters in particular. One cannot help smiling, therefore, when reading how our magnificent Rosa Luxemburg tries to prove with a very serious air and purely Marxist quote-unquote phrases that the demand for autonomy is applicable only to Poland and only by way of exception. Of course, there is not a grain of parochial patriotism in this. We have here only, quote, practical considerations. In the case of Lithuania, for example, Rosa Luxemburg takes 4 gubernias, Vilna, Kovno, Grodno, and Suwałki, assuring her readers and herself that these are inhabited mainly, quote-unquote, by Lithuanians, and by adding the inhabitants of these gubernias together, she finds that Lithuanians constitute 23% of the total population, and if Shmuds are added, they constitute 31%, less than a third. The natural inference is that the idea of autonomy for Lithuania is, quote, arbitrary and artificial, unquote. The reader who is familiar with the commonly known defects of our Russian official statistics will quickly see Rosa Luxemburg's mistake. Why take Grodno gubernia, where the Lithuanians constitute only 0.2%, or 1/5 of 1% of the population? Why take the whole Vilna gubernia and not its Troki Uyezd alone, where the Lithuanians constitute the majority of the population? Why take the whole Suwałki gubernia and put the number of Lithuanians at 52% of the population, and not the Lithuanian Uyezds of that gubernia, i.e. 5 out of the 7, in which Lithuanians constitute 72% of the population? It is ridiculous to talk about the conditions and demands of modern capitalism, while at the same time taking not the modern, not the capitalist, but the medieval, feudal, and official bureaucratic administrative divisions of Russia, and in their crudest form at that, gubernias instead of uyezds. Plainly, there can be no question of any serious local reform in Russia until these divisions are abolished and superseded by a really modern division that really meets the requirements not of the treasury, not of the bureaucracy, not of routine, not of the landlords, not of the priests, but of capitalism. And one of the modern requirements of capitalism is undoubtedly the greatest possible national uniformity of the population. For nationality and language identity are an important factor, making for the complete conquest of the home market and for complete freedom of economic intercourse. Oddly enough, this obvious mistake of Rosa Luxemburg's is repeated by the Bundist Madam, who sets out to prove not that Poland's specific features are, quote, exceptional, but that the principle of national territorial autonomy is unsuitable. The Bundists stand for national extraterritorial autonomy. The Bundists and liquidators collect from all over the world all the errors and all the opportunist vacillations of social democrats of different countries and different nations, and appropriate to themselves the worst they can find in world social democracy. Quick reminder here, when Lenin says social democrats and social democracy prior to 1917, this is basically a blanket term for all of Marxism, not the post-communist split of welfare capitalists and reformists as we think of them today. A scrapbook of Bundist and liquidator writings could, taken together, serve as a model social democratic museum of bad taste. Regional autonomy, Madame tells us didactically, is good for a region or a, quote, territory, but not for Lettish, Estonian, or other areas, okrugs, which have populations ranging from 500,000 to 2 million and areas equal to a gubernia. Quote, that would not be autonomy, but simply a zemstvo. Over this zemstvo, it would be necessary to establish real autonomy, unquote. And the author goes on to condemn the, quote, breakups of the old gubernias and uyezds. Source on this is V. Madam, or Madame, a contribution to the presentation of the national question in Russia from 1912. As a matter of fact, the preservation of the medieval, feudal, official administrative divisions means the breakup and mutilation of the conditions of modern capitalism. Only people imbued with the spirit of these divisions can, with the learned air of the expert, speculate on the contraposition of zemstvo and autonomy, calling for the stereotyped application of autonomy to large regions and of the zemstvo to small ones. Modern capitalism does not demand these bureaucratic stereotypes at all. Why national areas with populations not only of 500,000, but even of 50,000, should not be able to enjoy autonomy? Why such areas should not be able to unite in the most diverse ways with neighboring areas of different dimensions into a single autonomous territory, if that is convenient or necessary for economic intercourse? These things remain the secret of the Bundist Madam. We would mention that the Brun Social Democratic National Program is based entirely on national territorial autonomy. It proposes that Austria should be divided into, quote, nationally distinct areas, quote, instead of the historical crown lands, Clause 2 of the Brun program. We would not go as far as that. A uniform national population is undoubtedly one of the most reliable factors making for free, broad, and really modern commercial intercourse. It is beyond doubt that not a single Marxist, and not even a single firm Democrat, will stand up for the Austrian crown lands and the Russian gubernias and uyezds. The latter are not as bad as the Austrian crown lands, but they are very bad nevertheless. Or challenge the necessity of replacing these obsolete divisions by others that will conform as far as possible with the national composition of the population. Lastly, it is beyond doubt that in order to eliminate all national oppression, it is very important to create autonomous areas, however small, with entirely homogeneous populations, toward which members of the respective nationalities scattered all over the country, or even all over the world, could gravitate, and with which they could enter into relations and free associations of every kind. All this is indisputable, and can be argued against only from the hidebound, bureaucratic point of view. The national composition of the population, however, is one of the very important economic factors, but not the sole and not the most important factor. Towns, for example, play an extremely important economic role under capitalism, and everywhere, in Poland in Lithuania, in the Ukraine, in Great Russia, and elsewhere. The towns are marked by mixed populations to cut the towns off from the villages and areas that economically gravitate towards them, for the sake of the, quote, national factor would be absurd and impossible. That is why Marxists must not take their stand entirely and exclusively on the national territorial principle. The solution of the problem proposed by the last conference of Russian Marxists is far more correct than the Austrian. On this question, the conference advanced the following proposition, quote, must provide for wide regional autonomy, not for Poland alone, of course, but for all the regions of Russia, and fully democratic local self-government, and the boundaries of the self-governing and autonomous regions must be determined not by the boundaries of the present gubernias, uyezds, etc., but by the local inhabitants themselves, on the basis of their economic and social conditions, national makeup of the population, etc. Unquote. Here, the national composition of the population is placed on the same level as the other conditions, economic first, then social, etc., which must serve as a basis for determining the new boundaries that will meet the needs of modern capitalism, not of bureaucracy and Asiatic barbarism. The local population alone can assess those conditions with full precision, and on that basis, the central parliament of the country will determine the boundaries of the autonomous regions and the powers of autonomous diets. We have still to examine the question of the right of nations to self-determination. On this question, a whole collection of opportunists of all nationalities, the liquidator Semkovsky, the Bundist Liebman, and the Ukrainian National Socialist Lev Yurkovich, have set to work to popularize the errors of Rosa Luxemburg. This question, which has been so utterly confused by this whole collection, will be dealt with in our next article. There's a footnote there. Lenin is referring to an article he was planning. This is called The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, and it is one of the next audiobooks we'll be doing here on the channel, so look for that soon. It was originally written in 1914. So that marks the end of Chapter 6 and of the entire audiobook. What do you think? I think that this definitely did clear up some issues which still seem to confuse some Marxists in non-socialist countries today. Hopefully, it's only going to get clearer as we continue this series. I do have Lenin's other major work on the national question coming up, as well as a couple from Stalin and from other authors, so look for those coming soon. In the meantime, leave questions or comments in the comments area below. We'll continue the discussion there. I always welcome sincere and politely worded questions from anyone. This channel is designed to be accessible, though obviously if you're just coming to bash and be like, Mao killed 80 bajillion people, you know, that's not really welcome and you're probably just going to be banned. Anyway, I look forward to those comments. It's educational for me too, and sometimes they lead to entirely new ideas for videos or even video series, so do keep them coming. It also helps to boost the channel. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. Every donation is encouraging. They're also really materially helpful, so thank you very much. I greatly appreciate these. It has allowed me to do more videos than I would have been able to do without them. So it definitely makes a difference. If you'd like to help out without or in addition to making a financial contribution, hitting like, share, subscribe, and leaving a comment, even if it's just thanks or good video. All of that engagement helps to boost the video in the YouTube algorithm, and of course sharing it on your social media helps to expose the content to people who wouldn't have seen it otherwise, helps to expand the audience, and expand the audience it has because the channel has just been growing month after month. We gained about 600 subscribers in the past month. Welcome to all the newcomers. There's hundreds, there's I think over 160 or 170 audiobooks on the channel currently, plus all the current events, so do get caught up. There's a lot to learn, and if you're brand new, maybe try the basic Marxism-Leninism study guide video playlist. That's got some major works on it. Otherwise, you know, just look around at what's interesting and start there and ask questions, and this will lead you to other topics. Anyway, back in the real world, join an organization. All the education in the world is only going to get you so far. We do also have to get organized, and you know, the idea here is we're trying to end capitalism. That is the historic duty of the working class, to end capitalism, not merely to criticize it. So do get organized, and capitalism's going into severe crisis. There are definite opportunities for more real-world agitation, education, and organization. So let's get out there and do it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next video.